Kia ora koutou, e mihi ana kia koutou I tēnei rā. No mai haere mai ki te hui nei. We are just going to start, we'll open with karakia. It's end of the day, you probably will come in from lots of different kaupapa. It's really nice just to take a moment to ground ourselves, to breathe in and to centre ourselves as we start into this hui today. So, tēnā te karakia. Tūtaua mai I runga, tūtaua mai I raro, tūtaua mai I roto, tūtaua mai I waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, homie, huie, kai ki e. Ko wai au no ko te rana o ko tipuna, no o te tahi ahau, engari ko tamaki makaurau toko kāinga I nai nei, ko Judy Bruce toko ingoa. And I'm part of Leadership Lab, and it's great to be here with you all today. I'll hand over to Chris, who is going to mihi to you also.
Kia ora tātou. Toti me tūtai, tēnā koe te atua, nei nā mea katoa. Nā tangata katoa I huhi mai nei, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko kahukura te maungeru nei taku nākau, ko pāwahau te awa E mahara nei aku maharahara. No horana, no ingarangi o ke tipuna, no o tūtahi toku kāinga nai nei, ko Chris toko ingoa. So I work with Judy at Leadership Lab, among other things, and Leadership Lab's hosting this today, and just thought we'd share a wee slide with you. And obviously the kaupapa is systems change, introduction to systems change, and Judy will share a bit more about that. But just so you know, so Leadership Lab, this is a little sort of summary of our kaupapa around our uara in terms of values. I'll let you have a quick read of that. And I might explain why we're interested in systems change. The system we're trying to change is a thriving and equitable Aotearoa. Back to you, Jo.
Thanks, Chris. Also with us is Stephen McConaughey, who is part of Leadership Lab, and he's helping with IT today. And on our team is B, Dehan, and Erica Austin on this particular team as well. This is part of Roro, a Leadership Lab initiative. We started this series in 2023, an introduction to systems change in Aotearoa, and we hosted some people who have been working in this space, including Auckland Co-Design Lab and Te Kona Te Raki, and their work on Te Kore Kore Ka, and J. Tang Taylor joined us as well. And so we looked really at case studies last year. This year, we wanted to run a series based on feedback from people, which is really introductory to some of the key ideas that lie behind systems change. So we draw on systems change theory and complexity science. And we are going to try and keep it really simple and not get too technical. We'll share different definitions and frameworks for thinking about systems and systems change. And we'll also, when we're doing that, we understand that each kind of different idea has a usefulness in a given context, but that they're all ideas that also have limitations. So they're tools for thinking, really, and hopefully tools for practice and action as well. So this series, we also just wanted to share that it's workshop. So we understand that there's lots of experience in the Zoom room today, and we want the opportunity for people to be able to share. So on that note, there's a couple of ways that we really invite you to do that. One is to add your thoughts and your questions into chat, and we'll have a time for interactive kōrero later in the session. And the other way is that there's a shared doc that Chris or Stephen is going to drop into chat. And it's a systems change kite doc that we invite you to add really cool resources that you have found helpful when you've been working in systems change or thinking about systems change. So yeah, I think that's everything. Additionally, we are videoing the session today, just and letting you know that it will be available afterwards. And we invite you to register for the second and third sessions. If you want to watch the videos from last year, they are there in the Leadership Lab YouTube page, and you can follow up and see some of the things that were shared last year there. So thanks, everyone. I'll hand over to you, Chris. We'll make a start getting into it.
Kia ora, Jude. So thanks, Heath, for that. So let's go. Going to start with just saying that Jude and I both used to work at the university, and so we do have a tendency sometimes to use ridiculously big words that we're trying really hard not to do because it's not that helpful. But this whole field of systems thinking is pretty enormous, but also pretty basic, you know, like it's kind of intuitive. And so we're going to take that kind of approach today and kind of try and take it back to first principles. But we'll kind of explain that a little bit. So the first thing for me is like, what do we mean by system? You know, what is a system? Are we talking about the education system, the health system? You know, that's a group of schools or a group of hospitals or things. To us, where a system is anything where you've got individual agents, that's the kind of language used in systems thinking, and relationships between them. So I guess at the smallest level, you can have a system of two, which is like me and my 15-year-old who's I've been talking with today because she's sick. But on the biggest version, you could have a system of globe, you know, which is everybody on the planet. System could be organization, could be sector, could be team, could be right back down to two people. So it's really just a group of individual agents that have an interaction with each other or a relationship together. And sometimes those systems are sitting within each other, right? So small to medium to large. And it's just a way of thinking. So systems thinking then is an ability to see the world in that way, to see it as relationships and connections rather than individual parts, which sounds kind of obvious, doesn't it? But it's amazing how much education we've invested into ourselves to unthink thinking like that, and I'll explain that as we go here. The good thing about systems thinking that we've found is that you can actually get a really good idea of how to change the system. And I don't know about you, but I see a whole lot of systems that I'd like to contribute to changing. One of them I mentioned earlier around equity in our country. Now, I've put here a systems thinking whakapapa and question mark because some of the words you see on here are some of the types of things you'll get if you Google systems thinking. There is a lot of people done a lot of different things, but we kind of want to, I guess, critique that and say the idea of systems thinking is kind of intuitive and it's about the agents and the relationships. It's actually not a linear thing that this looks like. It's actually predates all of this in terms of it's an indigenous way of thinking. We are part of the land and the land is part of us. It's that kind of approach. What has happened is there's a whole lot of quite useful tools being overlaid on top of that, but it does get a bit confusing. So we're not going to go anywhere with any of that today. The way Jude and I have constructed these three hui though is to try and build the logic of how we might think from intuition to kind of action. So just for example, when you look at this slide here, I'm assuming the slides are working, Jude, are they? You happy? Yep, good. So yeah, what do you, when you see that there, what do you see? What are those bullet points? What are those topics? What would be the heading of that page if you had a heading? Just feel free to comment or just think, don't mind. It's kind of like global news, isn't it? You know, things that are happening around the globe. It's the kind of things you'd see on stuff or on the 6 o'clock news or whatever you feed you follow, right? And you can think of the actual examples in the world at the moment of all those different things, right? But you see the way it's actually drawn there is it's as if all of those are bullet points, when actually the reality is that's a very interconnected system. And if you have a look at that picture there, systems thinking tends to try and sometimes map things and draw connections, and you can see the units or the components, the agents and the relationships, which are the lines, you know, but you can see the connection, say, between climate and land use and maybe poverty on the right-hand side, leading to population, leading to food shortage, leading to land use. And then what's not drawn there is war, you know, which then leads to, you know, decrease in availability of resources, etc. So there's all these kind of connections of this part of the system with this part and this part, and sometimes they're not that obvious. because we tend to think this way. We tend to think in components, or it's more of a, I guess we'd say, a reductionist way or an itemized way. So the trick with systems thinking is to unthink what we've learned about breaking things down and try and put it back together and see the big picture and how the parts affect each other. And you'll soon see why that's really important. Way back in the day, Albert Einstein commented on this: we cannot solve problems with the same mindset that created them. So I guess what we're talking about here is that mindset of kind of breaking things down into component parts tends to backfire on us, even with our best intentions. Let's have a look at the next one. Peter Senge talked about this. The way organizations are is a product of how they think and how we interact. They cannot change in any fundamental way unless we change our basic patterns of thinking and interacting. And I guess what we're suggesting today is that a systems way of looking at our school, our hospital, our business, our community is a really useful way of thinking. I kind of like pictures, so this picture speaks 1,000 words to me. What's going on in that picture at the top there? Yeah, obviously the two gentlemen in the top having a bit of a sarcastic comment to the two at the bottom. I'm sure glad the hole is in our end, but how often do we find this, where we sort of end up in conflict with our colleagues and we ask ourselves, surely we do it for the same company, but why are we acting like your loss is not my loss as well, or your gain is not my gain as well? I guess the two guys at the top don't realize that the boat is in fact their system. And if the two at the bottom go down, they're all going to go down together. And why does that happen? It's because a Western way of thinking tends to like breaking things down into bits. And you can see those 5 words at the bottom. It's not a bad way of sort of breaking down knowledge into parts, but it also has a problem because it breaks away the system or the connection piece. So the idea of disciplines, you go to any study place, you can see the different types of disciplines, and it's broken into these boxes or sort of subjects, and then we have sectors, as if education sector is completely different than health. Well, it's actually the same person involved in both, but it's just, it's a separation that's kind of artificial. And it helps for some things like organization, but it doesn't help when it comes to thinking about impact. So the idea of systems thinking is to try and train ourselves to see connections instead of parts. Still see the parts, but look for the connections between them. And in a systems thinking, that's called the relationship. The relationship is the line that joins them. We have to understand the whole, but if we're going to understand the parts, what matters is the interaction between them. So I hope that's making sense. Just going to give an example here. And this is where system thinking is really important. Well, there's actually quite a few reasons, but again, a picture, Lewin's cartoon here. You've got this chap who's just quite naively pushing the block to the left of him, but you can see what's going to happen. It's going to come around and knock him on the other side. Now, the problem with his logic there is he doesn't realize that the block on the left is connected to the block on the right, around the back of him, obviously. But this idea of unintended consequences is something that happens where people do things, or we all do things with the best of intentions without realizing that because of the system effect, there might be a benefit there, but there's going to be two negative things that happen as well, because we treat them as if they're different. So like in a school, you might have a curriculum person and a pastoral person and a timetable person, and they're seen as 3 separate things. But actually all of those things, if you change one, affects the other two, all right, because it's connected. And I'll give you some examples, and we're going to ask you to have a think of your own examples of when have you seen this, the unintended consequences. But I'll give you a couple of examples. One are personal, one are professional. So personal, a few years ago, and I'm not sure why I did this, but I decided to I ran a half marathon and I survived it. And I thought, well, why don't I do a marathon? And I could never do it now, but back in, 5 years ago, I thought I could do that. So I went and started training, and then I realized that being 42 Ks, I'm going to have to do a lot of long training runs. So I sort of built up from a 1 hour run to an hour and a half to a 2 hour to a 2.5, to try and get enough fitness to be able to survive the 42 Ks. Now, why did I do that? I was trying to have a well-being benefit. I wanted to get fit. I wanted to challenge myself. I wanted to feel great about that. And it did all that. And I did do the Queenstown Marathon and I did survive it, only barely. But what were the unintended consequences of that? The unintended consequences were, one of them was that because of the length of my training runs, I had a lot less time with my family. And that affected another part of my well-being and their well-being as well. So while I was out running around the Avon River, doing all these long training runs and actually, getting fitter and fitter, some of the other parts of our family life weren't working so well. And in the end, I decided not to do more marathons because I just didn't want to sacrifice that time and all that discretionary time and give it to my marathon training. Yeah, I had the best intentions, but I guess I had to make a call. A professional one, Judy and I have both been involved in the past in working with challenging young people, rangatahi who don't fit so well in sort of regular education, and they, for whatever reason, might need some special kind of support. And one of those ways is alternative education or a specialized program. And if you think about this, if I had a whiteboard, I'd draw this, but you just have to picture it. Okay, so you've got these young people that are not coping very well in the class with the teachers, so they're getting a bit causing behavior problems, causing trouble for their peers and the teachers. And so there's kind of like, what are we going to do with these? So what the school decides to do is set up a special program for these young people. And what we'll do is we'll maybe have 2 teachers instead of 1, and we'll do a different kind of curriculum. We'll maybe do whole lot of literacy and numeracy, but in small groups in the morning, and then we'll do some outdoor education in the afternoon, right? And so it's kind of like a specialized program for these young people. And the idea is to, give them a bit more focused support, engage them, so their behavior improves and be able to re-engage back in the school. So it's a great intention, and schools all around New Zealand do that. But the problem is, well, one of the unintended consequences is that the program we offer through alternative ed is so good that the other kids who are mates of the kid who's now in alternative ed goes, oh, how come you get to do that? And how come you get to go out and do outdoor ed in the afternoon? And he or she says, well, it's because I'm in AE. And they say, how did you get in there? And they say, well, because I was naughty. So kids are pretty quick, and they're like, so you get to go out to read if you're naughty. Great. So let's be naughty. So the unintended consequence sometimes of these things is the opposite of what we intended here. We tried to decrease that kind of behavior. We're actually increasing it because we're creating an incentive for other young people to go, it's pretty obvious. I know how to get there. This is what I'm going to do. Right. So what do you do? It's quite tricky. And the trick, I guess the leadership approach to that would be to try and work out what's going on in that system of that school and think about what things can we change that will have a positive benefit without negative unintended consequences. So that's enough from me. We're going to ask you in a moment, we're going to go into groups of 3-ish, and want you to think about some examples of unintended consequences. So this is when people had the best of intentions, right? And they really thought they were doing a great thing, and maybe they did achieve a success in the thing they were focusing on, but there was some unintended consequences. So think about your professional life. If you want to think about a personal example, there's heaps of examples on the news. If you want to think about that, we're going to give you about 6 or 7 minutes to have a conversation. And if you could just start by obviously just saying, hello to the people that you end up in the group with and introducing yourself to each other. And then, Stephen's going to pop that question in there and have a conversation about it. Right? When have you seen unintended consequences? It's usually a sign that there's a system going on that we're not aware of.
So in the first half of this session, Chris was sharing about systems thinking. And what we're going to look at now is the idea or the concept of systems change and what is systems change. So firstly, we're just going to take a minute or 2 minutes even to have a look at this image. You might want to make it slightly bigger on your screen. And just take time to observe the image and see what you notice. So some of the things that I observed in this image from the Intersector project, which I thought was pretty cool actually, is that firstly, it's really messy. It's hard to make sense of. There are some dominant patterns and there are some strong connections. And you can see that there are kind of clusters or little nests, we call them, within bigger clusters or bigger nests. They're nested connections and relationships within a larger ecosystem. And you can see that everything is related through connecting connectors. You can see that it's non-linear. And Chris talked earlier about, when our dominant thinking has been shaped for centuries by Western thought, which is very linear, especially from Science and Enlightenment periods, it's hard for us to think in non-linear ways. So while in reality, this image is static, in reality, we know that complex systems are evolving, four-dimensional, constantly changing and shifting. So they're never just static like this. But I think it's helpful to look at this image and think about the complexities that exist within systems and how they are. Janella Meadows was one of the earlier thinkers about systems, and she talked about getting the beat of the system and how we can quite often jump in to solutions without first really understanding a system. Chris and I work a lot in schools, predominantly in organisational work, and it's quite easy, I know, to go in and jump into solution without reading the context in enough depth for enough time. It takes a lot of time, and the time is related to structural stuff like the policies that exist within an organisation. It's related to relationships that exist, and it's related to like dominant beliefs, as well as all of the macro landscapes that are impacting also on an organisation or a system. So what is systems change? So basically, we could see systems change as two key ideas. When repeated patterns within a system are disrupted in some way through changes to interactions into the ecosystem. And probably one of my favourite definitions by Social Innovation Generation in Canada is the systems change is shifting the conditions that hold a system in place. And so we're going to unpack that a little bit further. But before we do, a couple of other things. Systems change practices being able to spot patterns and sense make, like looking at that image that we just saw. How can you make sense of that? It takes time. And the second idea of our practice is to cultivate conditions for new patterns to emerge. So there's lots of different frameworks and models that you're probably already aware of. One that I've found really helpful as an introduction to systems change is to think about this work here, the Water of Systems Change. It's hard to ask on Zoom, but I'd love to know if people have seen this already. So if you have, you could do like a thumbs up or some kind of indication of how familiar you are to the Water of Systems Change model. If you're unfamiliar, just invite you to Google it. It's there. And this work has been put together by John Kania, Mark Kramer, and Peter Senge in about 2017, 2018. So it's kind of recent, but they were seeking to come up with a framework that makes it accessible for people to sort of, in an introductory way, understand systems change. So basically the idea is that they argue that there's 6 conditions that hold a system in place. So think about the organisation that you are currently in and think about the layers within that organisation. They suggest that there'll be 3 key layers that impact in your organisation. The first layer is structural. So you have policies, you have practices, and there are resource flow. So they are structural elements in your organisation. So the argument is that if you want to see a system change, you want to shift these 6 conditions to create system change. And so if you start, let's just stay with the structural change level. There are things that are really clearly visible. Often we can see, we know policy, it's concrete. That's our rules and our practice and our guidelines about how we do things. Practices at the activities that happen within an organisation, and resource flow is like our money, our staff, the assets, and those kind of things within an organisation. If you want to know the true vision of an organisation, then look where the resource flow is, because often organisations say that they exist for a reason, but in actual reality, their resources are all going into a different channel, and that would give you an indication of the reason that that organisation exists. So at the next level, so that they're really kind of systems change practitioners would say they're some of the within an organisation at least, may potentially some of the easier things to shift. But then things get a little bit more nuanced and less obvious at the relational level, and then again at the transformative level, which we'll go into now. So relational level, the things that exist in that level are the relationships and the different connections. So who are the actors in the system and how do they relate to each other? And then the power dynamics is who makes the decisions, who are the decision makers, who is at the table, who's missing from the table, and whose voices are being heard. And then the third level, transformative level, is very implicit. And they talk about that as being like mental models. A lot of people don't really like that term, but it's more thinking about what are the core beliefs, what are the core values, what are the core paradigms or the mindsets that are operating in an organisation or in a system that hold that system in place. So they're the different layers. So coming back to systems change and systems thinking, Danella Meadows said that the greatest change leverage points actually happen in the mental models or the paradigm space, that they're also the place that's the hardest to see shifts happen. But that when you're thinking about leverage where you want to influence or intervene in a system, that is some of the deepest, most difficult work that we can do. So to give you an example, when I'm working in schools, I work in cultural capability, and we go in and work with different schools. So we can see schools start to put into place change in policy, change in resource flow, maybe change in teaching practice, but it can often get stuck at that point because teachers teach who they are. So that means that we practice, whatever professional practice we do, we practice our beliefs. So that comes back to this idea of the challenge of mental model shifts or paradigm or belief shifts, that they are the thing that holds the system in place the most. Yeah, I think I might pause there. Really invite you now to have a wee think about this question here. Share an example of when you have noticed conditions shifting within an organisation. So it could be your own or an organisation that you've worked with that's led to systems change. It could be just something that you've observed or a story that you've heard. And we're going to invite you back into breakouts to share some of these ideas and start to share stories of transformation and change that you've been a part of, that you've noticed, or that you've heard stories of.